Afterwards, with Naomi Klein and Franklin Foer, continues.
Just to finish up this discussion about Iraq, because your book is about many other subjects than just the war in Iraq, since it's been a failure on some levels, maybe not all levels for disaster capitalism, what are the implications of the parts of the war that have been a failure for this theory?
Well, I mean, I do think that it has been chastening in terms of that cracking open that part of the world. So I think that that's one of the implications. But I think it's been really frightening to. I mean, this is why I'm coming back to the issue of profit and the emergence and the growth of what I'm calling the disaster capitalism complex. You know, this is what Eisenhower warned against, right? I mean, this is not some kooky theory. When he warned against the military-industrial complex, what he was saying was when you have such large profits being made from war and instability, then you have a very powerful political lobby that has the potential to distort policy because they have an active economic interest in continued instability. And I think that what we're seeing, and what's quite worrying, is I talk in the book about the Davos dilemma. And this was discussed at this year's World Economic Summit in Davos. Every year there's sort of a buzzword, and this past year it was the Davos dilemma. And what was the Davos dilemma? Well, according to Martin Wolf, a columnist in the Financial Times, he described the Davos dilemma as the paradox that the world was becoming more unstable, more crisis-prone, basically going to hell in a handbasket, high oil prices, war in Iraq, potential of a nuclear strike on Iran, climate change, Middle East crisis, and so on and so on. But at the same time, the stock market was doing very, very well, and there were record levels of economic growth. So this was the Davos dilemma. What is this paradox between between political crisis and economic benefit?
Isn't it interesting that in this kind of heart of the global economic elite in Davos, they would identify this dilemma and find it somewhat troubling. I mean, there's not the section of the elite that actually profits from disaster capitalism is only a swath of the elite, and a lot of other parts of the elite find this to be troubling and against their interests.
I think that's absolutely true, but it is an extraordinarily politically connected part of that elite, and I think you see that very clearly in Washington and the Homeland Security complex. This is really a sector of the economy that wasn't even identified as a sector before September 11th. Is now worth $200 billion, and that economy is utterly embedded in Washington lobbying and funding for political parties because it's not a normal economy. It's not in the free market. It's entirely dependent on getting government contracts. So it trades entirely in political influence. This is why the biggest problem at the Department of Homeland Security is that they can't hold on to staff. The top level is revolving so quickly, where people leave and they go into the Homeland Security complex and apply for the contracts that they used to issue. So I'm arguing in the book that the shock of September 11th, that the dislocation of September 11th, created the context for a new economy that was never that never admitted itself as such, and that it called itself the War on Terror. But the best way to actually understand what the War on Terror is as a new economy, with the Bush administration playing the role of venture capitalist, of deep-pocketed venture capitalist. That the way in which the War on Terror has been defined is a war against evil everywhere forever, against an enemy that you can't talk to because all they want is your annihilation, so that you have to protect the homeland against any conceivable threat and respond to any possible threat abroad as if it's a 100% threat. So this is, from a military perspective, unwinnable, but from an economic perspective, unbeatable, because you have absolute security in that market, because that war can't end.
Let's continue to unpack your description of what's happened after September 11th and kind of stay away from Iraq because you're describing other things that have happened we've already spent the first half of the show discussing Iraq. You say September 11th appeared to have provided Washington with the green light to stop asking countries if they wanted to have the U.S. version of free trade and democracy and to start imposing it with shock and awe military force. I mean, other than Iraq and Afghanistan, are there other things that you're thinking about when you wrote that?
Well, I was referring specifically to Iraq, but in the book, I first used the phrase disaster capitalism after the Asian tsunami, when I went to Sri Lanka 6 months after the tsunami hit to research the reconstruction and actually to contrast it with Iraq, and I found some really disturbing parallels, which is that just to give you one example, 4 days after the tsunami hit, the government pushed through a water privatization law, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, Sri Lanka, first of all, before the tsunami, had elections, and the party that was proposing these sort of neoliberal reforms prescribed by the IMF and the World Bank, water privatization, electricity privatization, labor market flexibility, all of these code words, or they don't say privatization anymore, they say public-private partnerships. This government was voted out of office and replaced with the center-left coalition that was promising not to do these things. So 4 days after the tsunami hit, hundreds of thousands of people are displaced, 40,000 people have been killed, the dead aren't even buried yet, and the government is pushing through a water privatization bill. So that's happening in the capital. That's happening in Colombo. The rest of the agenda is also being pushed through with renewed fervor. And I interviewed the top officials at the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, head of USAID in Sri Lanka, and on the coast, the people who were hurt the most by the tsunami were the coastal fishing people. These are the people who build their homes on the beach and have their boats on the beach. What was happening there was that hundreds of thousands of people, around 400,000 people, were moved to these inland camps, and they were told that they were being kept there for their safety because if another tsunami came, they would be hurt. Meanwhile, the coasts were being handed over to large resort developers and industrial fishing fleets. So that's also that's the example of what I'm talking about. Stop asking, start imposing. It's the window of opportunity that opens up, and Sri Lanka is a great example because it actually wasn't possible to impose these policies in the absence of a crisis. They tried, and in a normal, non-apocalyptic reality, the party that was promising to do it was voted out of office.
Does this make this libertarian ideology that you describe any different from any other ideology? As you point out in the book, the New Deal emerged out of the crisis of the Great Depression. Communism, the communist revolution in Russia emerged out of the crisis of World War I. This just seems to me part of the dynamic of almost every ideology.
Well, I think that there's a qualitative difference between the deliberate taking advantage of the disorientation in crisis and that people can't participate in these decisions, and using a crisis to push forward a populist agenda that actually has majority support. I would argue that the New Deal falls into that category. That it wasn't, that it wasn't the dislocation that was being taken advantage of. It was that people were angry, they wanted solutions, and you had a Keynesian and a social democratic leadership that was confident enough to take advantage of that moment. But
you can argue that there were. I mean, I'm a big fan of the New Deal myself. Yeah. But you'd also have to argue that they overreached and did things like try to pack the courts, and the National Recovery Act, which promoted a brand of regulation that I think most Americans at the time didn't consider to be acceptable. I mean, they did. I mean, they did take advantage of the moment, and they did overreach, and it's pretty well documented.
Well, but I still think that there was a difference in that moment. I think there was a base support behind that, behind the initial push.
Sure.
And I think that where the parallels deserve to be made is, looking at the Bolsheviks and the sort of desire for crisis and recognizing a crisis in capital as the opportunity to push through an agenda. Because, I mean, I think the real difference with the New Deal is that was a vision for a mixed economy. A mix and match economy that was not fundamentalist. I think Keynesians are compromisers by their very nature.